Welcome to our series entitled The Legends of Parks and Recreation, sponsored by the American Academy of Recreation and Park Administration. We're visiting today with Dr. Donald Henkel, who recently retired as the Director of Professional Services for the National Recreation and Park Association. In that role and throughout his career, Dr. Henkel has made a tremendous contribution to the entire area of professional development. Don has been a good professional colleague for many years and also a good friend, and it's for that reason I particularly look forward to our discussion today. Don, welcome.
It's nice being here, Tony.
You retired now how long ago?
Well, it seems like ages ago almost, but actually a little over 3 years ago.
Tell us what you've been doing.
Well, a lot of people ask me that. First of all, I guess I've moved to Michigan. We've had a cottage on Lake Michigan for over 30 years. With a magnificent view of the inland sea, which we call Lake Michigan. And one of the primary reasons we actually retired to that area is because of all the memories and all the good times we've had using that cottage. And so since we were not able to use it year-round, we bought a home nearby in Allegan, Michigan, located on some 5 acres with approximately 3.5 acres of woods and about 1,000 feet of frontage on the Kalamazoo River. Got a barn, etc. And primarily, I've had a real opportunity to enjoy one of the things that has become increasingly important to me, and that's the enjoyment of the outdoors, doing many of the things you might say full-time that I used to enjoy between, lunch hour or after work or on weekends or things along that line.
Well, that's been a lifelong interest for you, hasn't it?
Yes, it really has. I kind of look at it as kind of a window of opportunity, both for my wife Marilyn and myself, because we both really love the outdoors. We love the kind of area where we're at, and yet it provides us opportunity for some travel, etc.
Well, let's go back now a few years. Maybe more years than you want to remember at this point, to the beginnings. Let's start back and look at those things that shaped your life and the contributions that have developed throughout your career and our field. You grew up in Oak Park, Illinois, I understand.
That's right. Actually, one of the things that I'm most grateful, amongst many things, for my parents is that I really had a very stable childhood. My folks moved into the home they had when I was 6 months of age, and they had it through my college days and military career and after my wedding, etc. So
that's very unusual.
Very, very stable childhood, and probably there are a couple factors that had a lot of influence on me. First of all, we lived on Woodbine Avenue, located about a half a block away from the grade school that I went to, Horseman Grade School. And right across from the grade school is the Eugene Field Playground. And my guess is I spent, whatever time I wasn't in school, I spent over the playground area. And that was very, very influential in terms of my younger days there.
Well, tell us about Mom and Dad and brothers and sisters.
Right. Well, my mom and dad, as I say, my father was an accountant, and my mother, as was typical in those days, was a housewife. I was the youngest one. I was a spoiled brat in the family, and older brother Jim and Ruth Ann, my sister. And three of us, as I say, really had an excellent childhood and had many fine times there.
High school?
High school, Oak Park High School, Oak Park River Forest High School. And at that time, it was one of the top-rated high schools in the United States. Really an outstanding faculty, outstanding kinds of facilities. I became very actively involved in sports and football and basketball and baseball. The football team that I was on lost one game in 4 years. And when I went to Indiana University later,
Tony... That changed when you went
changed quite a bit, yes. As perhaps both of us know only too well. But that was very instrumental. And it was
What position did you play?
I played fullback, and I also was a place kicker. As a matter of fact, the first place kick I ever did was a drop kick through my folks' back porch window, and they appreciated that just immensely.
You're going to have to explain to some of our younger viewers what a drop kick is.
Well, I'm not quite sure how to explain that other than the fact that obviously no holders involved, and you simply drop the football and you try to kick it as straight as you can kick it. And of course that parlayed into some of the things that I did later on at Indiana University.
Tell us about those years at Indiana.
Well, those were interesting kinds of years. Actually, I went on a football scholarship, and as I indicated earlier, had a rather winning kind of tradition at the high school. And when I got to Indiana, Bo McMillan at that time was the coach, and then he left shortly after I got there. And I'll have to say that I was not the world's greatest football player. Although my junior year, I was actually the second highest scorer on the Indiana University football team because I was the place kicker. But I didn't have enough time in because they didn't keep time at that time to get a letter. And my senior year, they changed the rules of the game, and so I did not go out at that time.
It's been my experience that over the years, people tend to become better players as they remember what happened back there. Is that true in your...
Well, probably so, although I try to be somewhat realistic from that aspect.
Where did you go from Indiana then?
Well, from Indiana, I was a member of the ROTC, and I became a second lieutenant. My father-in-law likes to tell the story that what's lower than a second lieutenant, and of course before I could answer he said there's just nothing lower than a second lieutenant. And that's probably where I was. And I was in the States for a short while then. It was during the Korean War. Then I went overseas and was in Japan. And I helped defend our country by playing football and volleyball and softball and for the base teams over there. And it was a good experience, a good experience.
How did you get professionally involved in the field of Parks and Recreation?
Well, during my growing up years, I mentioned that I was at the playground quite a bit. Later on, I was a playground leader for a number of summers. I was, between my sophomore and junior year in high school, I was a camp counselor for a camp in Michigan, and as it turned out, it was the Sears YMCA camp, and I was, of course, born and raised in a lily white suburban community, and all these kids were from the tough inner city area of Chicago, so that was quite an experience for me.
Sure.
Later on, I was a camp program director for a YMCA camp. And so there were a number of those kinds of experiences that in a way, actually I came out of Indiana University with a psychology major, which, well, we both know that that's kind of an open-ended kind of situation. And I was really in a flux as to what I wanted to do when I got out of the military. And I was in the military for about 2 years. And actually I applied for and was accepted for an MBA at Indiana University. But somehow or another, my wife and I, before we got married, were camp counselors at George Williams College Camp in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. And we met some of the people from George Williams College who were counselors there. And basically they influenced me to consider my past, et cetera, and that really led into the graduate program in recreation at George Williams College. And Harry Edgren was one of the principals who were involved at that point in time.
Part of my early career involved directing YMCA camps, so
Is that right?
I relate to that. And
Yeah, it's
that.
an interesting kind of situation.
Well, you mentioned Marilyn. Tell us about how that all began.
Well, it began, I guess, when her folks moved in across the street when I think she was like in 7th grade or something.
She really was the girl next door?
Well, not next door, but across the street anyway. And of course, being a little bit older, I didn't pay a great deal of attention until along about my senior year in high school, in which I was playground leader, and my house was situated in such that when I went to work in the early afternoon, I'd go by her house and she was always out weeding the grass, et cetera, the lawn area, which is probably, well, I shouldn't say it's the last time she's weeded because she enjoys gardening a great deal. But one thing led to another, and we really had our romance during the college days. And she later on went to Indiana University and really did very well from that aspect.
Good. Well, you have some wonderful children, I know.
Yeah,
Tell us about
we really do. Yeah, we have 3 children that are all different, all unique human beings, as they should be. And Scott, Donna, and Bill, and a pride for us, really.
What are they doing now?
Well, my older son, Scott, is a partner for Ernst & Young in Minneapolis. And he has really been highly successful in the business career and does really very well. It's quite a contrast with my younger son, who is 30-some-odd years of age and is yet to have a full-time position, and yet probably has had more unique experiences than most human beings. He's been in the Peace Corps in Mali, West Africa. He's biked across the United States by himself, and from Alaska down to California, and many, many other things. He has recently completed a master's degree in park resources, but with a major emphasis in writing. And what he really wants to be is an environmental writer, and he's doing quite well in a very difficult field.
Right.
Daughter Donna is taken after her mother, who's a school teacher, English school teacher, teaching English, and in New Hampshire, and has 2 children and doing very well likewise.
Good. Well, we're taking you back and forth now, but let's go back to graduate study at George Williams. Tell us about that.
Well, that was an interesting experience because, of course, George Williams is now defunct, actually, and but was one of the 2 YMCA training programs.
Springfield College being the other one.
That is correct. That is correct. And so, although I had recreation courses, et cetera, there's a great bit of influence on group work, and that's kind of carried over a bit into some of my own philosophy and ways of doing things, and was a good transition from that aspect.
Good. Then after George Williams?
Well, then my first full-time position was in the small town of Loveland, Colorado, which is about 50 miles north of Denver. And we earned, as we all did probably in those days, not a great deal of money, but our first 2 children were born and raised there. And really was an excellent experience in that not only did I have my first administrative experience in actually directing and organizing a community recreation department and program and working with personnel, both paid as well as volunteers, but also began to give me an exposure to the state society, and people like Stu Case and Pecky Romans and others, people along that line were very influential to me. Lyle Beaver, who was in Fort Collins, I'm in Greeley, Colorado at that time. Also gave me exposure. I attended for a couple of years the NRA Executive Development Program at the University of Kansas. Larry Heeb was the organizer of that program. And that kind of opened up, certain kinds of perspectives in my own mind in terms of, first of all, I really kind of started to enjoy that kind of a give and take in academic community, et cetera, along with the balance of being an administrator and practitioner.
How large a community was Loveland at that
Loveland was about 8,000 or 9,000 people at that time, a rural community. And
so good
that was
size to get started.
Good. We lived right on Lake Loveland, overlooking the Rocky Mountains. It was just an idyllic kind of place, really. And it was a good place to start, a good place to get my feet on the ground, to kind of get used to managing a community setting, and also some broader kinds of experiences.
Well, how did you get from a place as idyllic as that back to the University of Illinois?
Well, it's kind of a long route.
You can expect a guy from Indiana to make a comment.
Right.
Really.
That's right. Well, basically, one of the things, of course, is you can't eat the scenery. And the pay scale at that time was not magnificent, I'd have to say that. But I think because of some of the exposures and so on, I guess I wanted some new challenges too.
And these development experiences you had along the way really whetted your appetite to go further with.
Well, that's correct. And so from that point, then I went to Villa Park, Illinois as Director of Parks and Recreation. So in a way, that added that new dimension of parks to what I was doing before, and that was very helpful to me. And obviously, a society like the Illinois Park and Recreation Society was and has been a very dynamic kind of society professionally. And a lot of really top kinds of people that I met and worked with, people like Bob Tolson and Bob Rui and many others along that line, were very instrumental during that period of time.
Then where from there?
Well, towards the latter stage of my time in Villa Park, I began to work on a project through the National Recreation Association to try to set some guidelines for the evaluation of community recreation programs. Betty Vandersmissen was the chair of that effort, and in each state in the Great Lakes region had a chair, and I was the chair for the state of Illinois, and I worked with people like Al Sapora and Ted Story and other people along that line in the state of Illinois, as well as many practitioners. And partially because of that effort and influence of people like, I remember when Lyle Beaver, he was doctoral student at Indiana University, and Marilyn and I, my wife, went down to visit him, and we talked about, you know, the concept of going back for a doctoral program, and that led on into it. And both Indiana and Illinois I evaluated very closely and decided on Illinois.
Well, having had one experience at Indiana and an unsuccessful football experience there, perhaps it's appropriate to go to Illinois. What was your major concentration in your doctoral work there?
Well, it seemed like no matter what course I took, as well as statistics, you know, I could take a Tiddlywinks course. I didn't take that, but it seemed to be a lot of statistics. But my dissertation area actually was an evolution from that earlier effort with Betty Vanderspissen and others. And actually my doctoral program took a total of, I think, about 21 months, all the coursework and the dissertation, et cetera. So it was a rather tight, full schedule during that time.
Can you remember the title of your dissertation?
Well, no, I can't, but basically it was one of the early experimental research types of dissertations. And the basic essence of it was trying to ascertain what effect a recreation experience had on a human being. And actually I used the media of drama to attempt to do this, and Bob Tolson, who was director in Oak Park, Illinois, and had several interns at that time, was very much assisting in this whole process, because we had a variety of different kinds of groups that were involved in a variety of different tests, and we took film and we had evaluations and so on. I'll have to say that it probably was not one of the great scientific breakthroughs of the era. But
however, that's a question we're still wrestling with today, and that was one of the early efforts in evaluating what effect these experiences do have.
And I think that probably that's going to be and is one of the critical areas for us to continuously look at, because I think the more we know about those kinds of things, I think the better job Park and Recreation Leisure Service professionals will do.
I don't think there's any question about that. Well, from the doctoral program, where?
From the doctoral program, National Recreation and Park Association.
What year was that?
That was in 1967. And
soon after the organizations were merged into NRPA.
Exactly. So I came into the system at a time which was really the early days of that organization. As you well know, Tony, it was the merger of 4 or 5 previous national organizations, National Recreation Association and others along that line. And it was quite an interesting experience for all of us at that point in time.
Well, recently we've attended the National Congress for Recreation and Parks at Minneapolis, and I recall that, I think it's 29 years ago now, that was the organizational meeting in 1965 when the organizations were merged, beginning with the next Congress in Washington in '66.
Right.
Is that my dates right there?
It sounds right. Actually, I think the first Congress of NRPA was 1966, and I attended as a delegate, little knowing that the next year I would be attending as a staff member.
What was that first position?
My first position, I'm not sure if I remember, but Woody Sutherland is the person who hired me. And a little bit of the background there is that in my work in Illinois, I worked quite extensively with Bob Horney, who was the district representative for NRA at that time. And when Woody was looking for an assistant, Bob Horney was one of the influential people that recommended me to Woody. And as you well know, Woody is certainly one of the true giants in the early days of our field.
Right, right. Well, talk about the NRPA experience.
Yeah. The early days in the, well, first of all, the original office was located a block from the White House, which was really quite an exciting place.
1700 Pennsylvania Avenue?
1700 Pennsylvania Avenue. Actually, there was our office, and then the old executive office building, and then the White House. And of course, it was during the era of the late 60s and all the turmoil, et cetera. And every day there were demonstrators out of the window, that you could see outside the window. A couple occasions on the way to work I got gassed in some of those demonstrations. And so that was quite a unique and rather exciting kind of experience. But of course in those days it was now it was the merger of several national organizations, but there were two principal organizations, the National Recreation Association and the American Institute of Park Executives. And I do recall as a young fledgling staff member sitting there kind of in the middle and watching on one side the old NRA staff and the old AIP staff, and the looks and the body gestures, et cetera, between the two were pretty difficult.
Well, that was really the culmination of many years of discussion regarding the direct relationship of parks and recreation.
That is correct.
Some of that's still going on today.
Yes, although I have to say that a lot of that has been alleviated, and I think both the recreation professionals, so to speak, and the park professionals recognize the value and the worth of the other.
It's hard to tell the difference between the two now.
Very, very much so.
Who was the executive director at that time, or who was your first boss?
My first boss was Sal Prezioso, and quite a dynamic character, as you well know, and an interesting person to work for. You know, in those early days, of course, this was the time of a lot of federal grants, and we really had a large staff that was brought in over a period of time under Sal as well as Dwight Reddy.
That was a boom time in Parks and Recreation.
That was the boom time. And of course, we had some very substantial donors to the organization at that time, which obviously helped a great deal. So that was quite a time in which you just had a large staff, and I was just one of the kind of the middle management staff at that point in time working for Woody.
Well, soon after that, you got involved almost full-time in the whole area of professional development that I mentioned earlier, and talk about how that developed and emerged into what later became issues like accreditation and certification and professional education and all of those things.
Well, during those periods of time, actually, one of my initial responsibilities was in continuing education, and so I did some management of some of the executive development programs and some programs along that line that Woody had been very instrumental in starting. I also was assigned as assistant that first year in 1967 as Congress Program Coordinator. And
you began that right away?
I began that right away, and the first year was in Miami Beach, and I was the assistant to Pete Rombold, and my duties and assignments were such that we did an Inside Passage cruise one afternoon. We had elegant dinners, you know, and things along that line. I thought, this is a pretty good deal, you know, pretty good deal. Well, then Pete left. And so really I assumed responsibility in the Congress program coordination area in 1968 in Seattle.
And you did that until you were retired? I
did that until I retired. And we may want to come back and we'll talk a little bit about some of those experiences. And Don Hawkins was the executive secretary for SPRE, the Society of Park and Recreation Educators, and then he left shortly, and then I assumed that responsibility. So those were some of the early responsibilities that I had. And then that department also has such things as the job placement of personnel services, and so I had some responsibilities in that area. And the NRP internship was pretty strong at that time, and so I had some
You coordinated the internship
Yes,
program.
I had some responsibilities. So those were kind of some of the early days, and I suppose that I would say that occupied maybe the first 5 to 7 years of the time I was with NRPA. And so at that point in time, I was in some of those kinds of programs, but I had not really gotten into the so-called professional standards or professional development kinds of things at that stage.
When you think about all of those kinds of programs that Dr. Henkel's been involved with, you can see almost immediately that there could hardly be a young person in our field today that hasn't been touched by one of those programs. It's incredible.
So. I would hope so. I would hope so. It's been, you know, it's been one of those kinds of things, Tony, that's evolved. And I remember when I was, perhaps it was at the University of Kansas Executive Development Program, and people like Joe Bannon were there, and they had George Butler that they brought in, who was a research consultant for NRA and wrote many of the pioneer textbooks, et cetera. And I can remember hoping that I someday might have some opportunity to have some influence nationally, et cetera. And so I've considered this a very rare kind of opportunity for all these years to have been involved at this level. And part of, the reason that I feel good about it is having had some of the grassroots kinds of experiences for about a decade or so prior to that
Prior
time.
to that, yeah. Well, let's take the entire area of certification registration as that developed and track that from its beginnings on into where it is today for just a moment.
Okay, I'll try to. Well, let me back up just a little bit, Tony, and say that it was probably in the early 70s that the concept of registration and certification and accreditation obviously had been worked on for several years by a lot of people,
Sure.
obviously.
Sure.
The Jan McLeans and Betty Vandersmithens and Edith Balls and people along that line,
Sure.
and registration, a similar kind of situation. And in the early 70s, as far as the registration certification component is concerned, we had a lot of states that had developed voluntary registration programs. And each of these programs obviously had its own agenda and its own standards and things along that line.
Only 2 states at that time had certification with standing in law, as I recall, and all the remainder were voluntary. Is that correct?
That's correct. And so one of the early efforts was to try to bring some commonality amongst the diverse standards that existed for the various state voluntary registration programs. So as I recall, it was somewhere around 1974 that NRPA organized really the voluntary registration program, developed a national voluntary registration plan.
Yeah.
And the concept there was to, and it didn't really have a lot of high standards or this type of thing, but some commonality in terms of education experience and a few things along that line. And those were kind of some rough days of trying to convince a number of states that they ought to buy into some program. And we have the concept, obviously, of state rights and things along that line.
Was that when the idea of reciprocity first came into the discussion?
Well, we had some reciprocity at that point in time. That's correct. So, as I recall, we finally ended up with maybe 35 states that bought into that program. And so that had some element of success. But as that kind of moved on, et cetera, one had to question, well, is it doing the job that it ought to do? Is it really setting any meaningful standards and things along that line?
When you left the position in retirement, still working with registration and certification, how many states were involved in the program?
Well, the transition into certification not only transitioned into the state kind of thing, but we also developed a direct national certification program, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But going back just slightly, basically accreditation, we'll come into that shortly also, began in 1974 also. So you really had a duality of standard setting kinds of programs that were initiated through NRPA on a national level.
For our new viewers, describe briefly the difference between registration, certification, and accreditation.
Well,
a very important
yes.
dichotomy.
Well, obviously, accreditation has to do with the standards set for the academic preparation program.
College and university curricula.
That is correct.
Okay.
College and university park recreation leisure service curricula. Registration and certification has to do with the qualifications of the individual practitioner. And so
those are parallel programs.
That is correct.
Okay.
So part of the transition in the registration process was that in the latter part of the 70s and along about 1980, I and many others began to question the worth and value of this program. It's simply, it'd gone a particular step, but it wasn't getting very far. And we decided, well, let's either do something that's going to really set some standards and move us forward, or let's forget it, So in 1981, which is a rather significant year, the voluntary registration program really was disbanded. Mm-hmm. And that was an advisory committee and so on, and a national certification board, which is a policy-making board. And that's unique in NRPA because you have the Board of Trustees as policy making, but the National Certification Board basically was given authority to make all of the policies and certification, just like the Council on Accreditation was given authority to make the policies in the accreditation area. And so the new National Certification Plan that was established kind of, in my judgment, created the framework within which a variety of professional development kinds of things could take place. To be rather specific, it mandated certain education and experience requirements, which the voluntary registration plan had done before, but tighter types of requirements. It gave preference to those who are graduates of accredited park and recreation curricula. And actually the early plans basically stated that within 5 years we're going to require all people to be graduates of accredited programs in order to be certified. Yep. Well, that fell by the wayside just beforehand. But anyway, that was a concept that in a way was carried over the linkage between those two kinds of programs.
Was there an examination involved at that point?
Yes. We developed, well, a couple things happened. The plan also mandated for the first time the concept of continuing one's education in order to be a professional in the field. And there was a lot of debate and discussion as to how that ought to be organized, whether you give points for being a committee member or this or that or whatever. And finally, the concept of the continuing education unit was born.
Is that what I hear everybody talking about, the CEUs?
Yeah, the CEUs. And that's been a rather interesting and remarkable kind of thing, because at the National Congress, as I recall, in 1981, that was the first time that the CEU was introduced at the National Congress.
In 81.
And as I recall, we had 2 programs that awarded CEUs at that time. And anybody looking at the Congress today obviously recognizes there's immense amount of that. And obviously it gave an opportunity for many groups to provide continuing education programs and towards CEUs, state park and recreation societies, and even colleges and universities, and many things along that line. And so
the idea being I have to have so many CEUs to keep my registration current.
To keep your certification current. That is correct. And though it's obviously nothing is perfect, and that's not a perfect program, I feel kind of good about the fact, and all of those of us involved, that it did indeed establish this concept. And it's not a unique concept by any matter of means, but the concept that you simply don't stop learning at any point in time. You've got to continue to learn. And
would it be possible to summarize the status, I guess, of certification at this point in this country? From those early beginnings, where is it today, in other words?
Well, let me go one step further, and I'll see if I can come back on that, Tony. Another part of the matrix, even though accreditation establishes standards for academic preparation programs, and continuing education establishes the concept that one ought to continue one's education, one of the other missing links was what is the knowledge base really of the individual practitioner at the front end of the process. And so an examination had been talked about for quite a period of time, and had been discussed as to what levels and what type of examinations and things along that line. And after a great deal of debate and discussion, it was decided that we ought to develop an examination that an individual must pass at the entry into the professional status of certification.
Okay.
And so we developed, Bob Tolson was the chair of a committee, of a job analysis committee, which was the front-end process of developing an examination. And this was a very exciting kind of time period in actually trying to grapple with and grope, well, what are the kinds of knowledges that an entry-level professional ought to have? And the concept that we really evolved was that there's a broad array of different kinds of things. It's not enough to know just about the park resources side. It's not enough just to know about therapeutic recreation. It's not enough just to know about recreation programming. It's not enough just to know about some of the philosophical bases, but one ought to have those combinations of things.
To be able to integrate them.
That is correct. And so this was the front end of that examination development process. And we hired a professional concern. We finally got enough money to do that, which, as you well know, is always a struggle. And then we actually got into the examination development, and Doug Sessoms chaired that effort. And we brought in quite a diverse group of people, along with the examination testing company, to develop the examination. And so that was a rather significant step.
About what year was that? Do you recall?
Oh, my goodness gracious.
Approximately?
Maybe 5, 6, well, maybe 8 years ago now, 7 years ago, something along that line. And of course, part of the concern about us old professionals and so on, I'm not going to take an exam. By golly, I forgot more than I've ever learned along that line. So there was really quite a grandfathering period of time. For those who were certified, didn't have to take the exam initially, and we gave a 2 or 3 year period of time in which if you became certified, you would not have to take the exam.
There's always a transitional period.
That's right. And so in the early days, very few took the exam. Yeah. And it appears to me is that increasing numbers, especially probably some of the younger graduates who are coming out of Park and Recreation curricula, are beginning to buy into this program. I think the book is still very open as to whether or not certification is going to succeed or not.
Are agencies requiring certification for employment?
Well, obviously one of the things that we worked on very much through Professional and Development Committee, the National Certification Board, was the concept of not necessarily requiring certification for employment, but making that certainly one of the desirable criteria for employment. And
salary differentials?
Well, even that too, I would imagine. And I guess my own feeling is that the ball is in the camp of Park and Recreation, primarily administrators who control the jobs, to choose whether or not this is important or not. And time's going to tell whether or not it is.
Well, then you feel the mechanism is in place.
Exactly.
To initiate a major thrust in the certification area if the profession chooses to do it.
That is correct. And you know, I see signs of growing interest in this. Obviously, the whole concept of CEUs has expanded dramatically. For a while there, we were attempting to influence the trustees to mandate that they be certified to be professionals, members of the trustees, and they decided not to do so, but they did decide to at least identify those individuals who were certified leisure professionals, for example. And you begin to see more and more listings and indications of those in a broad array of things.
And a lot of professionals using the initials CLP after their names to indicate they're certified professionals in the field.
That's correct. And so, you know, it's hard to, I think obviously we have to start with our own professional people first, and they're the ones who are going to have to try to influence the power brokers, the village and city managers, and the elected officials and people along that line. I certainly have a great deal of optimism for that, but I've been optimistic before, and perhaps not as realistic as I should be at
Well,
times.
it's come a long way, and it has been a joint venture with the other piece of those parallel programs that we were talking about. Let's go back and pick up accreditation now, which the original concept began way back in the 50s and 60s, but then developed on into the program that exists today. How did you get involved with accreditation?
Well, I walked into the executive director's office one day, and he says, "Don, I think you ought to go over to that council meeting and kind of work with that council, et cetera."
Now, what council is that?
This is the Council on Accreditation. And as I alluded to earlier, this is a policy-making body also. It's a body which was created by the National Recreation and Park Association in cooperation with AALR.
What is AALR?
Now, you ought to know that better than I do, Tony. American Association for Leisure and Recreation.
Right.
And obviously, there's a great deal of background on this whole situation. But a council was created and the first meeting was held in 1974 in Denver, Colorado. Dr. David Gray was the first chair of the council, and I served as staff liaison from the first meeting until I retired in 1991.
You really did all of the staff work on that.
Well,
this was a major contribution.
Yeah, it was a fascinating experience, as you well know. And of course, I'm going to talk in just a minute about some of your involvement, et cetera. But it was a remarkable group of human beings and individuals who really came forth to be of service in the council. And I guess I would start, obviously, first with Dave Gray. His presence on the council, in my judgment, and his stature and his demeanor and so on, was the type of thing that was needed in a very critical time period. It was a time period, as you well know, Tony, in which there were a lot of doubts and a lot of naysayers and so on and so forth. And there's still obviously some of that, but in those early days, much more. And there's a lot of things that really had to be done a lot of things had been done, but a lot of things had to be done in the beginning. And I recall in some of the early meetings in which the council was debating an issue and trying to decide what to do or for the bylaws or the standards or procedures or whatever, and that discussion would go on, and I could see Dave Gray all of a sudden kind of bending his head down, taking his pen to paper and just kind of very quietly writing, and while this debate and discussion went on, and pretty soon in his very quiet manner raised his head and say, let me suggest the following. Yeah. And he would read, and all of a sudden, everything would coalesce together. He had a remarkable ability to bring the diversity of issues and interests and so on into a program of action, et cetera.
Now, the standards and evaluation criteria were set. A procedure for accrediting institutions was developed, and there were 4 pilot programs, as I recall.
Yes, I believe that's correct, which was prior. Actually, this took place prior to the formation of the Council on Accreditation, and that's where people like Jan McLean and Betty Vandersmith and others were involved. Yeah. And not only that, but also the California Park and Recreation Society had initiated an accreditation program. So one of the issues there is whether or not the states were going to operate their own accreditation programs or whether we were going to have a national accreditation program.
What was the first institution accredited?
The first institution accredited by the new Council on Accreditation was, as I recall, in May of 1977, North Carolina State University. And
some of those other institutions were brought into it as a result of the earlier programs, but NC State was the first.
That's correct. NC State was the first one. And I recall Dr. Edith Ball, who was one of the early pioneers also. She was really the first member of that early pioneer group that worked for so many years and struggled for so many years to get recognition by the National Commission on Accrediting. And
why was that important?
Well, I think our fledgling field, was trying to get some stature and some recognition, et cetera. And some of the early attempts to get that, as you well know, it simply did not succeed. And that's one of the reasons for deciding after all these efforts to go to in-house accreditation through the National Recreation and Park Association in 1974.
Well, with all the colleges and universities around the country that had programs in parks and recreation, why was the national accrediting body, I guess I should say the body that recognized accrediting agencies, why was it reluctant to recognize this program?
In my judgment, Tony, there are 2 principal reasons involved. The first reason is that it seemed to me that the powers that be in that structure, now that structure is created by the university presidents and those types of people, they had a real reluctance to admit they did not want to see a proliferation of specialized accrediting bodies. They really had a real reluctance, I think, to allow new kids in on their party unless they really prove themselves and this type of thing.
Every professional group wanted their own accreditation.
That is correct. And so I think this was one of the significant factors back then and continued to be for a number of years. I think the other
still is today.
Was that they didn't think that we had defined ourselves in a clearly definitive way that differentiated us from other specialized disciplines. And that concept carried in a great deal. And
going back to our long-term struggle with who we are and what we are and what is it we're supposed to do.
That's correct.
They picked up on that.
That's right.
They're smart people.
and maybe this is the time, Tony, to talk about COPA, which is the Council on Post-Secondary Accreditation.
Which followed the original group.
That's correct. Yeah, the National Commission on Accrediting, which some of our pioneers sought to get recognition from and failed to get recognition from, then transformed into COPA, the Council on Post-Secondary Accreditation. And in the early days of the Council, we really didn't think about trying to get recognition from COPA. Our agenda was to get the bylaw set and to get the standards set and to get the procedures set up and to deal with issues of actually operationalizing the entire program.
About how many institutions a year came before the council in those earlier times?
Boy, it's hard for me to remember. It seems to me that there were maybe like 2 or 3 initially, and then that grew into maybe a dozen or so. And of course, after a while, you got into the reaccreditation or the continuing accreditation process. So you had the new ones plus the update of the old ones and things along that line.
So this council was a very hard-working council.
The council was a very hard-working council, and you were a member of the council for 8 years or so. And probably, you know, you talk about that, it's probably one of the hardest working groups that I'm aware of within the NRPA structure.
So
these people really put in long hours and work very hard.
So you would come together as a council at the National Congress and at the National Convention for the American Alliance of Health, Physical Education, and Recreation, twice a year, in other words.
That is correct. That is correct.
And work for how many days? All day?
Well, of course, in the early days, the first meeting was for 2 hours, something along that line. And by the time both of us retired, more or less, one way or the other, it was several days that we were taking. Obviously, there was the council business, and there was also all the hearings that took place. And
well, along with that, then we continued with our concern for the recognition by the national accrediting body.
That is correct.
COPA, Council on Post-Secondary Accreditation that you mentioned a moment ago. So we worked together. That's one of the fond memories, I suppose, of my career and in our struggle. It was probably, as we said at some point in an article we did, I think the most frustrating, discouraging, exhilarating, and exciting experience we've had, I think.
Yeah.
Describe briefly that process and how we got to the ultimate recognition of COPA.
Well, this is where we both have to be together, Tony, because first of all, it was a great experience, obviously, for me and I think for both of us. And as you say, very frustrating. The first few years, as you well know, we didn't know what target we were aiming at. COPA really was in a turmoil. Their staff turnover was just immense. And you go from 1 month to the next month and so on and so forth, and you get this kind of directive or that kind of directive, and it was really very, very difficult. And
because their program and their mission was evolving as our field was evolving.
Exactly, exactly. And as I recall, finally there was a gentleman who came in by the name of
McLeod.
McLeod,
right.
That's correct. And whose first name was?
Bill.
Bill McLeod, that's right.
You're taxing my memory now.
And probably the combination of the fact that we had a reasonable amount of perseverance over those 8 years, Tony, plus the fact that I think that there was a continuity both of you and myself and Bill McLeod at COPA, probably gave us a fighting chance anyway to get recognition by COPA. And as you well know, finally they settled on some criteria and standards in written form upon which then we could develop documents to apply for recognition.
So we had to put together documents to get the recognition almost in exactly the same way that an institution prepares its report and its documents to be considered for accreditation by the council.
That is correct. And then, as I recall, in those days there was a so-called pre-application process, and basically this is, I think, their way of running you through a lot of hoops in terms of whether or not you really deserve to be considered or not. And those were tough days. And as I recall, one of the things that had to be done is to deal with our nemesis, the definition of the field. And that was a toughie.
All right, and that was the single biggest factor. How did we deal with that?
Well, Not very well at first. As I recall, in the early days, we got pretty well lambasted by the, we're God, motherhood, and apple pie, and all that type of thing, and they simply didn't buy it. They simply didn't buy it. And they said, go back to the drawing board or forget it. And, you and I went back to the drawing board quite often.
Several times.
And I think finally, after, quite a period of time, we went out to the field and invited some of the people in the field to suggest some definitions to us that they thought would be helpful that might serve.
And that was useful, as I recall. One of the problems that we encountered on it would be that philosophically the field was evolving and developing on a rather broad base. But the Council on Post-Secondary Accreditation was looking for some specific professional mission that could be identified. So we had to resolve the conflicts between the broad philosophical base and a fairly defined area, which we ultimately were able to do.
That's correct. A little bit of the background that I recall, Tony, and I think we each bring our own kind of background from this aspect, is that I recall Bill Nepoth out in California had talked with one of his professor friends out there, and that gentleman had suggested that we really ought to be the study of something or other, and that, in my judgment anyway, gave a certain, perhaps, approach to this issue. And so I know a number of drafts were written, and I can kind of recall that it may have been like on a Friday afternoon in one of your many trips into the Washington, D.C. area in a motel room outside of Dulles Airport that we kind of hammered out our concept of the definition that we had. And what I'd like to do, if I may, at this point in time is read one of the well-guarded secrets of this into the record.
You make me a bit nervous about that, Don.
That's right, because I think after all, over a period of time, hopefully somebody's going to update this and change this, or obviously everybody's ignored it up to this point in time. But anyway, let me do so, if I may.
Okay.
This is really the definition that we finally submitted to the COPA, and either they were totally confused by it, or say so much persistence on our part, or they said, maybe that makes some sense.
It worked, at least.
It worked. Okay. It worked. And really, in the working of it, and once we found out that they had accepted this, in my judgment, this was the single factor that allowed us to proceed to get recognition by COPA.
Right.
So anyway, the definition which we evolved was, and I quote, recreation, leisure services, and resources education is the study of leisure behavior and its effect upon people and social institutions. Leisure behavior can enhance or debilitate the quality of life for individuals. It can be a positive or destructive societal force. The leisure service professional utilizes the knowledge and motivation of leisure behavior to, 1, conceptualize, plan, organize, implement, and evaluate recreation and leisure activity that generates positive human and community development. 2, enhance people's abilities and satisfactions from participation in leisure activity. And 3, develop, design, maintain, or preserve quality natural or man-made physical environments that serve as the place where leisure activity is principally expressed. So that was the definition we ended up with, Tony, good, bad, or otherwise.
Well, in our frustration to receive the recognition, I had almost forgotten the definition. It still sounds pretty good.
Well, anyway, the accreditation experience was quite an experience. As you well know, our efforts were an 8-year effort in the COPA recognition process from 1978 to 19, well, it was whatever the number of years are. Yeah, that's right.
Right.
Actually, 1986, I guess, is when we received it.
Actually achieved it. That's correct. What that really said, I think, for our field, Don, is that is the first time that any comprehensive higher education body in this country recognized the study or the professional preparation of Park and Recreation graduates as a legitimate form of academic endeavor. A real milestone, I think for our field.
I think so, Tony. And, you know, time's going to tell how significant that is, but I've got to believe the same way that you do. And again, this is part, in my judgment, of the mosaic of attempting to develop practitioners who are competent in our field. And the recognition process is very much a part of that, because it gives that kind of recognition to those standard-setting programs in accreditation in Park and Recreation.
And both the certification side of it and the accreditation side comes together at the end in terms of preparing people to do what they should in our field.
And I think that probably I kind of like to say there's two ways I've earned my keep during the years I was at NRPA. One was the financial keep in being the Congress program coordinator and the amount of revenue and so on.
I want to get to that before our time is up, too. Go ahead.
And the other is the keep, I think, as far as the profession is concerned.
No question about that. Dramatic, dramatic. Now, before we tell people more about the accreditation process than anybody really wants to know, let's jump over in the few minutes we have left to talk about the Congress. You were involved with planning the Congress program for all of those years. And most people have no concept of what an immense task that is. At the current Congress, there would be approximately how many educational program sessions?
As I understand, there's pretty close to 300 separate education programs.
300 programs to be planned, to be delivered in one place.
That is correct.
During 1 week. That's an enormous task. All of that has to be coordinated and put together, primarily with the staff work that you did during those years and with the current person.
Yeah, as I told you earlier, my experience in Miami Beach, you know, going on the cruises and so on, is a bit of a cry or a difference from.
I was going to say, I don't recall that as much cruising experience in putting those programs
together. Not a great deal. And like a lot of things, you know, the Congress has gone through quite a transition time period. But I did come in 1968, really as the first Congress program coordinator in our Congress in Seattle, Washington. A longshoreman by the name of Eric Hoffer.
I recall that.
Was the opening general session speaker, a bald-headed guy, dynamic as all get out, roved over the stage, etc.
In his dock worker's uniform and
uniform,
boots.
etc. And that was an exciting experience for me. The early days, pretty much, I was kind of on my own. I kind of planned the whole thing, and we solicited input and so on. And after a while, the concept of having a program committee evolved. And in those early days, I really didn't ask the program committee to do too much. I asked them to think about a theme and develop a theme, think about a format, and make some suggestions of programs, and that was about it.
Then they became heavily involved.
Well, then there was almost mutiny one year, as I recall. They said, what in the world are you bringing us in to this location, spending all this money, and you really aren't tapping into our expertise and so on.
And then you ultimately did that. In the couple minutes we have left, Don, I'm going to ask you a question that might throw you just a bit. But there have been lots of experiences in working with the Congress. But what would be the funniest or most unusual thing that happened, apart from the electric horseman that you and I were involved with one year and some other things? What one experience stands out? Let
me list two very briefly. First of all, one year the chairman of the board was in a turkey caller national organization.
Oh,
and he mandated that we have a turkey caller at the opening general session. Well, that was quite a stitch. That was quite a stitch.
I recall that.
We had a lot of feedback on that, and a lot of the staff had fought the executive director not to have that, but we had it anyway, etc.
What was the other one?
The other one was here in Minneapolis. And there was a nightclub group called the Dudley Riggs Players.
Dudley
Riggs Players. And we were more or less pushed into having this, and we had, finally, through pressure from the local group, we had them on the opening general session. Had it all pre-programmed, what they were going to do, etc. Well, they diverted from what we had planned, and they were so bad totally. You know, my normal position is backstage, and a lot of people around. And all of a sudden I looked up, and there was nobody backstage, and people were leaving by the hundreds out in the audience. They were so terrible.
And you were there all by yourself?
I was all there by myself, and so early the next morning, about 4 a.m., the executive director called me on the phone and said, Well, I may have my turkey colors, but you've got your Dudley Race players.
Good for you, Don. Our time is up. It's a great spot to end, I think. It's been really great to talk with you about your career, your development, and to visit with a good friend.
It's been a pleasure.
I'm Tony Mobley in the series of Legends of Professionals in Parks and Recreation. Thank you.